The chains were cold against Elena's wrists as the guards dragged her through the iron gates of a fortress she had never seen before. Smoke still rose behind her from the village she called home, though no fire had touched it. It was fear that burned there now, fear that her people would never forget. Elena did not cry. She kept her chin high, even as the guards pushed her forward across the stone courtyard, past rows of soldiers who did not look at her twice. She was nothing to them, just another captive brought back from the raid on the border packs. She had heard the name Ragnar whispered in her village long before she ever saw his face. They called him the Alpha King, with no mercy, a ruler who had taken the throne through conquest and kept it through fear. Some said he had not smiled in 10 years. Some said he did not feel anything at all. Elena had always thought these were just stories, told to frighten children. Now, standing in the shadow of his fortress walls, she was no longer sure. The guards did not explain why she had been taken. She was a healer, not a fighter, not a spy, not someone who carried secrets worth stealing. But when Ragnar's soldiers descended on her village, searching for traitors who had once served in his court, they took anyone who looked useful and left the rest to rebuild what remained. Elena's knowledge of herbs and wound care had marked her as valuable enough to keep alive, though value in this place clearly did not mean safety. They led her down a narrow staircase that spiraled beneath the fortress, the air growing colder and danker with every step. The dungeon at the bottom was little more than a row of stone cells, lit by torches that flickered against slick walls. A guard shoved her into one of the cells and locked the door without a word. Elena pressed her back against the wall and closed her eyes, forcing her breathing to slow the way her aunt had taught her long ago. Panic never helped a wound heal, and panic would not help her survive this either. Days passed with no clear count. The only light came from torches outside her cell, and the only sound was the occasional footsteps of guards making their rounds. Elena spent her time studying the walls, memorizing every crack and shadow, anything to keep her mind sharp. She tore a strip of cloth from the hem of her dress to bind a cut on her arm that had never been properly cleaned during the raid. She used what little water she was given to rinse the wound, murmuring old words her aunt used to whisper over the sick, though she no longer fully believed they carried any real power. One evening, a young guard named Edmund approached her cell with a tray of food that was slightly more generous than what she usually received. He glanced around before speaking, his voice low. He told her that word of her healing skill had reached certain ears within the fortress. Elena asked him whose ears, though she suspected she already knew. Edmund only shook his head and told her to eat while she could. Word had a way of traveling fast, in a place built on fear, and not always in ways that helped the person being spoken about. That night, Elena lay awake staring at the ceiling of her cell, turning over every possibility in her mind. If the king wanted her dead, he would have simply ordered it already. If he wanted information, he would have questioned her by now. There was only one reason left that made any sense, and it chilled her more than the stone floor beneath her. Somewhere above her, behind those fortress walls, someone powerful was suffering from a wound that would not heal, and someone had told him about a captive healer with unusual skill. Elena did not know then how right she was, or how deeply that single wound would change the course of her life. Above the dungeons, in a chamber lit only by low-burning candles, King Ragnar sat alone, with his shirt pulled aside, staring down at a wound along his ribs that had refused to close for nearly a year. His healers had tried salves, stitches, and prayers, and still the skin remained raw and angry, as though something beneath it resisted every attempt at repair. He did not speak of the wound to his council. He did not speak of it to anyone. A king who could not heal was a king who could be questioned, and Ragnar had spent too many years building a reputation that discouraged questions of any kind. His advisor, a steady and quiet man named Nathaniel, was the only person who knew the full truth of how the wound had come to be. He was also the one who first mentioned the captive healer from the border raid, a woman whose knowledge of old remedies had reportedly saved more lives in her village than the official healers assigned to that region. Ragnar had dismissed the suggestion at first. He did not trust captives, and he especially did not trust captives who might see too much of what lay beneath his armor, both the physical wound and everything it represented. But as another week passed with no improvement, and as the pain grew sharp enough to disturb even his sleep, Ragnar found himself reconsidering. He told himself it meant nothing beyond practicality. A king needed to function. A king needed to lead armies and hold court, and appear untouched by weakness. If a captive healer could accomplish what his own physicians could not, then pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. Late one night, without informing his council, Ragnar ordered Edmund to bring the healer from the border village to his private chamber. Edmund hesitated only a moment before obeying, and by the time the door opened and Elena was pushed inside, still bound at the wrists, Ragnar had already decided he would give her one chance to prove her worth, and no more than that. Elena entered the chamber with her eyes lowered, though she lifted them the moment the door closed behind her. She had expected a monster, something twisted and cruel in appearance to match the stories. Instead, she found a man seated in shadow, broad-shouldered and still, his expression carved from stone rather than fury. He did not shout or threaten her the way she expected. He simply gestured toward his side, where a strip of cloth barely concealed a wound that even from a distance looked wrong in ways she could not yet explain. Ragnar's voice was low when he finally spoke, informing her plainly that his physicians had failed and that she had been brought here to succeed where they could not. He did not ask if she was willing. He did not offer any kindness or explanation. He simply expected obedience, the same way he expected obedience from every soldier and subject within his kingdom. Elena stepped closer, despite every instinct urging her to keep her distance. She had spent her life learning to read wounds the way others read words on a page, and something about this one unsettled her from the very first glance. The skin around it was inflamed in a pattern too precise to be natural, threading outward like something had been carved into him rather than simply cut. She asked, carefully and without fear in her voice, how long he had carried this wound. Ragnar's jaw tightened at the question, as though he had not expected her to ask anything at all. He answered only that it did not matter how long, only that it needed to end. Elena did not press further, though she filed the reaction away for later. A king who avoided a simple question about time was a king hiding something far larger than a stubborn wound. She knelt beside him, her chained wrists making the movement awkward, and studied the wound more closely under the candlelight. It was warm to the touch in a way that suggested infection, yet there was no true infection to be found beneath the surface. Elena had seen many wounds in her years of healing, wounds from blades and fire, and even from creatures no larger than a child's fist, but she had never seen skin that resisted closing in quite this manner, as though something invisible held it open on purpose. She asked if he had suffered any strange sickness alongside the wound, any dreams that repeated themselves, any moments where his strength seemed to fade without explanation. Ragnar's eyes narrowed, and for a brief instant, something flickered behind his composed expression that looked almost like fear, though he masked it quickly with irritation instead. He told her sharply that she was here to heal, not to interrogate a king about matters beyond her understanding. Elena lowered her gaze, though inwardly she remained certain of what she had seen. Whatever caused this wound was not something a simple poultice could cure. Still, she understood the danger of pushing a man like Ragnar too far too quickly, especially while bound and entirely at his mercy. She asked instead for clean water, fresh cloth, and a handful of herbs she listed by name. Herbs she doubted his physicians had thought to combine in the specific manner her aunt once taught her. Ragnar snapped his fingers, and within minutes, Edmund returned carrying everything she requested. Elena worked carefully, cleaning the wound as gently as her bound hands allowed, applying a mixture of herbs that released a sharp, earthy scent into the chamber. Ragnar watched her closely, his body tense, clearly unused to allowing anyone this near him, let alone a captive he barely knew. As she worked, Elena noticed something else troubling. Scattered across his ribs and along his shoulder were older scars, faded but numerous, evidence of a life shaped by far more violence than any single battle could explain. She said nothing about them, though she wondered what kind of man carried so many marks, and still refused to acknowledge even one of them aloud. When she finished, the wound looked no different in appearance, though Ragnar seemed to breathe slightly easier, the tension in his shoulders loosening by a fraction. He studied her for a long moment before speaking again, his voice quieter than before, though no less commanding. He told her she would return the following night, and every night after that, until the wound closed completely. Elena did not argue. She understood this was not a request. As the guards led her back down to her cell, Elena found herself replaying every detail of the encounter, searching for answers in what she had seen and heard. The wound was not ordinary. The king's reaction to her questions was not ordinary either. Something dark and hidden connected the two, and Elena, despite every reason to fear this place and the man who ruled it, felt an unfamiliar pull toward uncovering exactly what that connection was. She lay on the cold stone floor that night, with her wrists still marked from the chains, staring up into darkness, wondering what kind of man could build an entire kingdom on fear, while hiding a wound he refused to name. She wondered, too, why the sight of his carefully guarded eyes lingered in her mind long after the chamber door had closed behind her, refusing to fade the way exhaustion usually erased every other thought before sleep finally came. Above her, in his private chamber, Ragnar sat alone once more, staring down at the wound that had resisted healing for so long. For the first time and longer than he could remember, the pain felt slightly less consuming, though he told himself it meant nothing beyond simple relief. He did not allow himself to consider why the healer's steady hands and unflinching gaze had unsettled him more deeply than any blade ever had. He told himself he would summon her again only because his body required it, nothing more. But even as he extinguished the candles and settled into a restless sleep, some quiet part of him already understood that nothing about this arrangement would remain as simple as he wished it to be. Elena returned to Ragnar's chamber the following night exactly as ordered, though this time the guards loosened her chains slightly, allowing her hands enough freedom to work properly. She said nothing about the change, though she noticed it immediately. Small details like this told her more about a person than words ever could, and she filed it away alongside everything else she had learned about the king in their first meeting. The wound looked no worse than before, though it remained stubbornly open, refusing every attempt at closure. Elena knelt beside him again, cleaning the area with practiced care, while Ragnar sat in silence, his eyes fixed somewhere on the far wall rather than on her. She sensed the tension in him, the same guarded stillness she had noticed the previous night, as though he were bracing himself against something far worse than pain. She worked quietly for several minutes before finally speaking, choosing her words carefully. She told him that wounds like this, ones that resisted every remedy, often carried more than a physical cause. She did not use the word curse, not yet, though the thought had crossed her mind more than once since their first meeting. Ragnar's expression tightened, and for a moment she thought he might order her silent, or send her away entirely. Instead, after a long pause, he asked quietly what she meant. Elena chose her next words with even greater care, aware that pushing too hard might close this rare opening before it had a chance to reveal anything useful. She explained that certain wounds carried patterns beneath the skin that resembled markings rather than injuries, and that such patterns sometimes pointed toward old magic, the kind woven with intention rather than accident. She asked, gently, whether anyone with knowledge of such things had been present when this wound was first made. Ragnar's silence stretched long enough that Elena began to wonder if he would answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its usual command, replaced instead by something quieter and more guarded. He told her only that the wound came from a betrayal, though he refused to elaborate further. Elena did not press him that night, sensing that trust, however small, needed to be built slowly rather than demanded all at once. Over the following days, Elena's visits to the king's chamber became a strange kind of routine. Each night she cleaned and treated the wound, and each night Ragnar revealed a little more, though always reluctantly and always with visible effort. She learned that he had once trusted someone deeply, someone close enough to stand beside him during the darkest years of building his kingdom. She learned that this trust had been repaid with something that still haunted him, though he never spoke the details plainly, only circling around them the way a wounded animal circles a trap it refuses to step into fully. Elena, in turn, found herself sharing small pieces of her own life, though she was careful about how much she revealed. She spoke of her aunt, the woman who had trained her in the old healing arts passed down through generations of women in her village. She spoke of the herbs that grew along the riverbanks near her home, and the quiet satisfaction of watching a wound close beneath careful hands. She did not speak of her fear, or of the uncertainty that gripped her every time she considered what might happen to her once the king's wound finally healed, if it ever did. One evening, as she worked, Ragnar asked her directly why she showed no fear in his presence, despite everything she must have heard about him before her capture. Elena considered the question seriously before answering. She told him that fear rarely helped a healer do her work properly, and that she had learned long ago to set it aside when treating anyone, regardless of who they were or what reputation preceded them. She added, more quietly, that perhaps the stories she had heard did not match entirely with the man she had come to know over these past several nights. Ragnar's eyes met hers then, something unreadable flickering behind his usual composure. He did not respond immediately, and Elena wondered if she had spoken too boldly, but instead of anger, she saw something closer to surprise settle across his features, as though no one had suggested such a thing to him in longer than he could remember. Days turned into a week, and though the wound showed no significant improvement in appearance, something else had clearly begun to shift. Ragnar's guards noticed the change in his mood, subtle though it was. He no longer snapped at every small failure brought before him during his morning court sessions. Nathaniel, ever watchful, noted quietly to himself that his king seemed slightly less burdened than he had in the years since taking the throne, though he said nothing of it openly, understanding the fragile nature of whatever change was taking place. Elena, for her part, began to notice things about the fortress beyond the walls of Ragnar's chamber. She saw the way servants moved quickly and quietly, careful never to draw unwanted attention. She saw the way certain members of his court watched her with narrowed eyes whenever she passed, clearly displeased by the growing frequency of her visits to the king. She understood, even without being told directly, that her presence had begun to unsettle people who valued the current order of things, people who saw any change in the king as a potential threat to their own positions of influence. One night, as she finished treating the wound, Elena noticed something she had not seen clearly before. Beneath the layers of scarring across Ragnar's shoulder and chest, faint lines seemed to trace a pattern too deliberate to be accidental, similar in style to the markings around the newer wound on his ribs. She asked carefully whether these older scars shared a connection with whatever had caused his current suffering. Ragnar's entire posture stiffened at the question. For a moment, Elena feared she had finally pushed too far, that this single question might undo whatever fragile trust had grown between them over the past several nights. But then, slowly, he began to speak, his voice low and controlled, though clearly strained beneath the surface. He told her of a war fought many years earlier, a war that had cost him his brother, and nearly cost him his own life. He spoke of the scars that remained from that time, marks he had carried in silence ever since, refusing to let anyone see the depth of what that loss had done to him. Elena listened without interrupting, understanding instinctively that this moment required patience rather than questions. When he finished speaking, silence settled over the chamber, heavy, but not entirely uncomfortable. Elena reached out, hesitating only slightly, and placed her hand gently near one of the older scars along his shoulder, not to treat it, but simply to acknowledge what he had shared with her. Ragnar did not pull away. For the first time since she had entered his chamber that first night, he allowed himself to sit in stillness beside her, neither guarded nor commanding, simply present in a way that felt entirely unfamiliar to him. Elena said nothing further, sensing that words might break whatever fragile peace had settled between them in that moment. As she prepared to leave that night, Ragnar spoke once more, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. He told her that no one within his fortress had heard the full truth of that old war, not even Nathaniel, who had served him faithfully since the earliest days of his reign. Elena understood the weight of what he had just given her, a piece of himself far more valuable than any treasure his kingdom possessed. She returned to her cell that night, with her mind full of everything she had learned, uncertain what to make of the strange shift taking place within her, a shift she was reluctant to name even to herself. She told herself that her growing understanding of Ragnar was simply part of her work as a healer, nothing more than professional necessity. But even as she closed her eyes, she found herself thinking not of the wound she needed to heal, but of the quiet vulnerability she had glimpsed behind the king's carefully built walls. Above her, in his chamber, Ragnar remained awake long after she had gone, staring at the ceiling with a strange lightness settling somewhere in his chest, a feeling he could not quite identify, though it felt distinctly different from anything he had experienced in the many long years since he had first claimed his throne. News of the king's changed mood spread quickly through the fortress, though no one dared speak of it openly. Servants whispered among themselves about the captive healer summoned each night to his private chamber, wondering aloud what kind of remedy could account for such a noticeable shift in his temperament. Among those who noticed most closely was a nobleman named Duke Aldrich, a senior member of Ragnar's council, whose influence had grown steadily over the years, through careful loyalty and quiet manipulation. Aldrich had spent a long time positioning himself close to the throne, ensuring that his opinions carried weight in every major decision affecting the kingdom. A king, distracted by personal matters, especially matters involving a captive of unknown loyalty, represented both an opportunity and a threat, depending on how the situation unfolded. He began watching Elena's movements more closely, noting the exact time she was summoned, and the exact duration of her visits, gathering information the way a hunter gathers signs of prey, before deciding how best to strike. Elena remained unaware of this growing attention, as she continued her nightly visits to Ragnar's chamber. The wound along his ribs had begun to show the faintest signs of improvement, the angry redness fading slightly at the edges, though the deeper markings beneath the skin remained as strange and stubborn as ever. She continued asking careful questions, piecing together fragments of the story behind his suffering, though Ragnar remained guarded about certain details, even as he opened up about others. One evening, as she cleaned the wound, Ragnar mentioned a name for the first time since her arrival. He spoke of a woman named Vivian, someone who had once stood beside him as his intended mate, before circumstances changed entirely. His voice grew distant as he spoke, careful and measured, though Elena noticed the way his hands tightened slightly against the arms of his chair whenever the name passed his lips. She did not press him for further details that night, understanding that some truths required time to surface naturally, rather than being forced into the open before their moment arrived. Instead, she focused on her work, applying a fresh mixture of herbs she had adjusted slightly, based on what she had observed over the past several sessions. Ragnar watched her hands move with practiced precision, and for a moment his guarded expression softened into something closer to genuine curiosity. He asked her, unexpectedly, about her life before the raid that brought her here. Elena hesitated only briefly before answering honestly. She spoke of quiet mornings spent gathering herbs along the riverbank near her village, of the small wooden house she shared with her aunt, of the simple satisfaction that came from helping her neighbors recover from illness or injury. She spoke of her parents, both gone now, taken by a sickness no remedy could cure, and how that loss had shaped her decision to dedicate her life to healing others in whatever way she could. Ragnar listened closely, something in his expression shifting as she spoke, as though he were seeing her clearly for the first time, not as a captive brought here out of necessity, but as a person with her own history of loss and resilience. When she finished, he remained quiet for a long moment before speaking again, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. He told her that he understood loss far better than most people realized, though he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge it openly. Elena found herself drawn further into conversation with him that night than any previous visit, the careful distance between healer and captive beginning to blur into something neither of them fully understood. She asked him, gently, what kind of king he might have been, if circumstances had unfolded differently, if betrayal and loss had never shaped the path he now walked. Ragnar considered the question seriously, something rare crossing his features, an expression close to genuine reflection, rather than practiced control. He admitted, quietly, that he sometimes wondered the same thing himself, though he rarely allowed such thoughts to linger for long. Elena reached out instinctively, placing her hand near his without fully deciding to do so, and for a moment, neither of them moved, the quiet chamber holding a silence that felt entirely different from the tension that had marked their earliest meetings. The moment passed quickly, interrupted by a soft knock at the chamber door. Edmund entered, informing Ragnar that Duke Aldrich had requested an urgent meeting regarding matters along the northern border. Ragnar's expression shifted immediately back into its usual guarded composure, the walls he had briefly lowered rising once more, as duty reclaimed his attention. Elena understood the shift without needing explanation, gathering her supplies quietly, as Ragnar rose to attend to whatever business awaited him. Before she left, however, Ragnar paused, turning back toward her with an expression she had not seen from him before, something almost hesitant beneath his usual authority. He told her, quietly, that her presence had made these past several nights easier to bear than any time he could remember since claiming his throne. Elena's chest tightened at his words, though she said nothing in response beyond a small nod, uncertain how to address the growing warmth she felt whenever he spoke to her this way. As she returned to her cell that night, escorted once again by Edmund, she noticed the guard glancing at her with an expression she could not quite place. When she asked him directly what troubled him, Edmund hesitated before admitting that certain members of the court had begun asking questions about her, questions that suggested growing suspicion rather than simple curiosity. He warned her, carefully, to remain cautious, reminding her that not everyone within the fortress welcomed the changes taking place in their king. Elena thanked him for the warning, though the words did little to ease the unease settling in her chest. She understood, more clearly than ever, that whatever was growing between herself and Ragnar carried consequences far beyond the walls of his private chamber. She lay awake that night, turning over everything Edmund had told her, wondering how much danger truly surrounded her, and how much longer this fragile peace between herself and the king could last, before the forces working against them found a way to tear it apart entirely. Meanwhile, in a separate wing of the fortress, Duke Aldrich met quietly with several other members of the council, men who shared his growing concern over the king's apparent fascination with the captive healer. They spoke in low voices, careful not to be overheard, discussing what action might be necessary should this fascination continue to grow unchecked. Aldrich reminded them all that a king, weakened by personal attachment, represented a danger to the stability they had all worked so hard to maintain, and that certain measures, however unpleasant, might soon become necessary to protect the kingdom's future. None of them spoke openly of harming Elena directly, though the implication lingered heavily beneath their careful words. Aldrich assured his fellow council members that he would handle the matter delicately, gathering more information before deciding on the best course of action. He understood, better than most, that acting too quickly against a king's growing affection could backfire terribly if not managed with precision and patience. As the night wore on, Ragnar sat alone in his private study, staring at reports from the northern border that required his attention, though his thoughts kept drifting back to the healer currently locked away in his dungeons. He found himself troubled by the growing realization that he no longer thought of her simply as a captive, or even simply as someone tasked with healing his stubborn wound. Something deeper had begun taking root within him, something he had not allowed himself to feel since the betrayal that had left him hollow and guarded for so many years. He rubbed absently at the wound along his ribs, noting that the pain, while still present, had grown slightly more manageable over these past several days. He wondered, with a mixture of hope and lingering suspicion born from past betrayal, whether the improvement stemmed purely from Elena's herbal remedies, or whether something else entirely, something far less easily explained, had begun working beneath the surface of his carefully guarded heart. The following days brought a subtle change in how Elena was treated within the fortress. Her chains, once tight and unforgiving, were replaced with a simple bracelet of iron that allowed her far greater freedom of movement, though she remained officially a captive under the king's authority. She was given a small room near the healer's quarters instead of the dungeon cell she had occupied since her arrival, along with better meals and access to a modest collection of texts on herbal medicine that had belonged to the fortress's previous head healer. Elena understood these changes came directly from Ragnar, though he never spoke of them openly. She found herself grateful, though also increasingly aware of how precarious her position truly was. Kindness from a king known throughout the land for his harsh rule could shift as quickly as it had appeared, and she reminded herself constantly not to grow too comfortable in this strange new arrangement. Her nightly visits to Ragnar's chamber continued, though the atmosphere between them had shifted noticeably since the night he first spoke of his lost brother and the woman named Vivian. Elena found herself looking forward to these visits in a way she had not expected, and she suspected, from the way Ragnar's expression softened whenever she entered the room, that he felt something similar, even if neither of them spoke it aloud. One evening, as she examined the wound along his ribs, she noticed something different. The angry redness that had persisted for months had faded considerably, though the strange markings beneath the surface remained as visible as ever, refusing to disappear entirely, despite the physical healing taking place around them. She pointed this out to Ragnar, careful to keep her tone professional despite the warmth she felt whenever she was this close to him. Ragnar studied the wound himself, running his fingers lightly over the healing skin, something like genuine wonder crossing his features. He admitted quietly that he had begun to believe this wound would never improve at all, that he had resigned himself to carrying it, and the pain it brought, for the remainder of his life. Elena's chest tightened at his words, and she found herself reaching out instinctively, her hand resting gently against his side, near the healing wound. Ragnar went still beneath her touch, though he did not pull away. Instead, he reached up slowly and placed his own hand over hers, holding it there against his skin for a long moment, the silence between them heavy with something neither had yet found the courage to name. Elena's heart raced, and she wondered if he could feel it through the contact between their hands. the rapid rhythm that betrayed everything she had tried so carefully to keep hidden since her arrival in this place. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, with an emotion she had not heard from him before. He told her that he had spent so many years building walls around himself, convinced that vulnerability of any kind represented weakness a king could not afford to show. He admitted that her presence had begun to challenge everything he believed about strength and control, and that he no longer fully understood how to reconcile the man he had forced himself to become, with whatever he was slowly turning into now, in her presence. Elena listened carefully, understanding the enormous weight behind his admission. She told him, gently, that true strength often looked entirely different from what people expected, that allowing oneself to heal, to feel, to trust again after betrayal, required a courage far greater than any battlefield victory could demonstrate. Ragnar's eyes met hers then, something raw and unguarded flickering behind his usual composure, and for a moment, the careful distance between captive and king dissolved entirely. Their conversation that night continued long past the usual duration of her visits, Ragnar speaking more openly than he had at any point since her arrival. He told her fragments of his childhood, growing up as the second son never expected to inherit the throne, forced into leadership only after tragedy claimed those who should have ruled before him. He spoke of the crushing weight of responsibility that had settled onto his shoulders far too young, and how he had learned to mask every uncertainty behind a carefully constructed mask of unwavering authority. Elena shared more of her own story in turn, speaking of the years spent studying under her aunt's careful guidance, learning not just the practical skills of healing, but the deeper patience required to understand what a person truly needed, beyond the obvious symptoms presented before her. She spoke of moments of doubt in her own abilities, times when a patient's suffering had felt beyond her power to ease, and the quiet determination that had carried her through those difficult periods regardless. As the night deepened, Ragnar asked her a question that caught her entirely off guard. He wanted to know whether she still feared him, despite everything that had passed between them over these recent weeks. Elena considered the question honestly before answering, understanding that her response carried significant weight for both of them. She told him that whatever fear she had once felt had faded considerably, replaced instead by a growing understanding of the man behind the reputation, a man far more complicated and far more human than the stories had ever suggested. Ragnar's expression shifted at her words, something like relief mixed with lingering disbelief crossing his features, as though he had expected a different answer entirely, one rooted in continued fear or careful diplomacy rather than genuine honesty. He reached up then, his fingers brushing lightly against her cheek, in a gesture so gentle it seemed entirely at odds with everything the kingdom believed about their ruthless king. Elena did not pull away from his touch, though her breath caught at the unexpected tenderness of the gesture. She found herself studying his face closely in the candlelight, noticing details she had missed during their earlier, more guarded encounters, the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the subtle softening of his features whenever he allowed himself a rare moment of genuine emotion rather than practiced control. Their moment together was interrupted once again by a knock at the door, though this time it was Nathaniel who entered, his expression carefully neutral despite the obvious tension he must have sensed within the room. He informed Ragnar quietly that reports had arrived from the northern border requiring immediate attention, matters that could not wait until morning. Ragnar's expression tightened with visible reluctance, as duty called him away from the rare peace he had found within Elena's presence. Before she left that night, Ragnar took her hand once more, holding it briefly with a gentleness that spoke volumes beyond anything words could convey. He told her, quietly, that he looked forward to her return the following evening more than he cared to admit, even to himself. Elena left his chamber, with her heart racing, uncertain how to process the growing intensity of feeling that had taken root within her, despite every reason for caution that circumstance demanded. As she made her way back toward her quarters, escorted by a guard she did not recognize, she noticed Duke Aldrich watching from a shadowed archway, his expression unreadable, but his eyes tracking her movements with unmistakable suspicion. Elena felt a chill settle over her despite the warmth still lingering from her time with Ragnar, an instinctive understanding that powerful forces within this fortress viewed her growing closeness to the king as something dangerous, something that needed to be addressed before it grew any further beyond their control. That night, alone in her quarters, Elena found herself torn between the growing warmth she felt toward Ragnar and the persistent unease that had settled over her since Edmund's earlier warning. She understood that whatever was developing between herself and the king existed within a world of political danger far beyond anything she had ever navigated before, a world where affection could quickly become a weapon used against both of them by those seeking to protect their own interests. She resolved, as sleep finally began to claim her, that regardless of the danger surrounding this unexpected connection, she could no longer deny the depth of feeling that had grown within her over these past weeks. Whatever came next, she would face it honestly, refusing to retreat behind fear, the same way she had refused to retreat from the very first night she stood before the Alpha King and looked past his fearsome reputation to see the wounded man hidden beneath. A storm rolled over the fortress the following night, thunder rattling the tall windows of Ragnar's chamber as Elena arrived for her usual visit. She found him sitting near the fireplace rather than his usual chair, his expression more strained than she had seen in several days. When she asked what troubled him, he admitted that the wound had begun aching more sharply than usual, a familiar warning sign that always preceded what he described only as bad nights when old memories surfaced with unbearable clarity. Elena knelt beside him immediately, examining the wound with careful attention. The skin looked much the same as before, the redness still faded from its earlier severity, though something beneath the surface seemed to pulse faintly, almost imperceptibly, in time with the distant thunder outside. She frowned, unable to explain the sensation through any medical knowledge she possessed, though her instincts told her this was connected somehow to whatever dark magic had caused the wound in the first place. She asked him gently to tell her more about the night this wound had first appeared, understanding that the storm outside seemed to be stirring memories he usually kept carefully buried. Ragnar hesitated for a long moment before finally speaking, his voice low and strained as he described the events of that night for the first time since her arrival. He told her of Vivienne, the woman he had once trusted completely, who had stood beside him as his intended mate during the earliest years of his rule. He described how she had seemed devoted, how their bond had felt genuine, until the night everything changed. He spoke of discovering her true intentions, a plot involving rival pacts seeking to weaken his kingdom from within, a betrayal so complete that it had left him questioning everything he thought he understood about loyalty and love. The wound, he explained haltingly, had appeared during the confrontation that followed his discovery, though he had never fully understood how she managed to create something that resisted every attempt at healing in the years since. He suspected dark magic, though he had never spoken this suspicion aloud to anyone, fearing it would be seen as weakness rather than the genuine mystery it represented. Elena listened with growing understanding, pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. She had suspected from her earliest examination of the wound that some form of old magic lingered within it, magic tied specifically to betrayal and broken trust. She realized now that the wound likely served as more than simple physical damage. It functioned as a curse, one designed to keep Ragnar forever trapped within the pain of that betrayal, unable to fully heal or move forward from the moment his trust had been so completely shattered. She shared this theory carefully with Ragnar, watching his expression shift from confusion to dawning realization as her words settled over him. He admitted that such an explanation made a strange kind of sense, given how the wound had resisted every conventional treatment despite improvements in the surrounding skin. Elena reached for his hand instinctively, offering what comfort she could as he processed this new understanding of the suffering he had carried in silence for so long. Thunder crashed outside, closer now, and Ragnar flinched slightly at the sound, old memories clearly still weighing heavily upon him despite the passage of years. Elena moved closer, her hand still holding his, offering quiet reassurance through her steady presence, rather than empty words that could never fully address the depth of pain he carried. As the storm raged on outside, Ragnar spoke again, his voice softer now, admitting something he had never confessed to anyone before. He told her that the curse, if that was truly what it was, had done more than simply wound his body. It had convinced him, deep within his heart, that he was destined to remain forever unloved, that trust once broken could never be genuinely rebuilt, that anyone who claimed to care for him would eventually reveal their own hidden betrayal given enough time. Elena's chest ached at his words, understanding now the true depth of what this curse had stolen from him, far beyond simple physical suffering. She reached up, her fingers gently tracing the edge of the wound along his ribs, careful and deliberate in her touch. Ragnar watched her closely, something vulnerable and searching in his expression, as though he were waiting to see whether she too would eventually prove his darkest fears correct. Without fully deciding to do so, Elena leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss against the worst of the scarring along his ribs. An old healing tradition passed down through generations of women in her family, meant to channel comfort and genuine care, alongside whatever physical remedy was being applied. It was a gesture she had performed countless times before, for patients suffering deep emotional wounds alongside physical ones, though she had never expected it to carry such profound weight as it did in this moment. The effect was immediate and startling. Ragnar gasped sharply, his entire body tensing as a strange warmth spread outward from where her lips had touched his skin. The faint pulsing sensation Elena had noticed earlier seemed to flare briefly, before settling into something calmer, steadier, as though whatever dark energy had lingered within the wound had been momentarily disrupted by the genuine affection behind her gesture. Elena pulled back slightly, startled by his reaction, uncertain what exactly had just occurred between them. Ragnar stared down at the wound, his expression a mixture of shock and something close to wonder. He told her, his voice unsteady, that the pain had eased more significantly in that single moment than through any treatment applied over the past several weeks combined. Neither of them fully understood what had just happened, though both sensed instinctively that something significant had shifted, not just within the wound itself, but within whatever remained of the curse that had bound Ragnar to his suffering for so many years. Elena studied his face carefully, searching for any sign of the strain and pain that had marked his expression only moments earlier, finding instead a calmness she had not witnessed since her arrival in the fortress. Ragnar reached up slowly, his hand cupping her face with a tenderness that contrasted sharply with the fearsome reputation the entire kingdom associated with their king. He told her, quietly, that whatever she had just done had touched something far deeper than the physical wound alone, something he had believed permanently closed off since the night of Vivian's betrayal. Elena leaned into his touch, her own heart racing at the intimacy of the moment, the walls between captive and king dissolving further with every passing second. They remained like that for a long moment, neither speaking, the storm outside gradually beginning to quiet, as though echoing whatever peace had settled between them within the chamber. Elena finally broke the silence, asking softly whether he understood now what she had suspected all along, that the true remedy for his suffering had never been found in herbs or salves alone, but in something far more difficult to provide, genuine care freely given, without expectation of betrayal in return. Ragnar's eyes glistened slightly in the firelight, an emotion he clearly struggled to name, openly settling across his features. He admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, that he had convinced himself long ago that he was undeserving of such care, that his position and his past made him unfit for anything beyond calculated alliances and careful distance. Elena shook her head gently, telling him that no person, regardless of title or past mistakes, deserved to remain forever trapped within someone else's cruelty. As the night wore on, the two of them remained close together near the fireplace, speaking in quieter tones than they had ever used before, the careful distance of captive and king, replaced by something far more genuine and far more dangerous, given the political reality surrounding them both. Elena knew, even as she allowed herself this rare moment of connection, that whatever had shifted between them tonight would not go unnoticed by those within the fortress who already viewed her presence with growing suspicion. But for this single night, wrapped in the quiet aftermath of the storm and the strange magic of the moment they had just shared, Elena allowed herself to simply exist within the warmth of this unexpected connection, refusing to let fear of tomorrow's consequences steal away the significance of what had just occurred between herself and the once cruel Alpha King, who was slowly, unmistakably, beginning to change before her very eyes. The morning after the storm, Ragnar woke feeling something he had not experienced in years, a lightness in his chest that seemed entirely disconnected from the burdens of his throne. He rose earlier than usual, examining the wound along his ribs in the mirror of his private chamber, noting that the strange pulsing sensation had not returned since Elena's gesture the previous night. The skin still bore its scarring, likely permanent regardless of any remedy, but the deeper ache that had haunted him for so long felt noticeably diminished. He found himself thinking of her throughout his morning duties, distracted during council meetings, in a way that had never troubled him before. Nathaniel noticed the shift immediately, though he said nothing directly, choosing instead to observe quietly, as his king's attention wandered more than once during discussions regarding trade agreements with neighboring territories. When the meeting finally concluded, Nathaniel lingered behind, waiting until the chamber had emptied, before addressing Ragnar privately. He asked, carefully, whether something had changed regarding the healer currently residing within the fortress. Ragnar considered deflecting the question entirely, his old instincts urging caution regarding any admission of vulnerability, even to his most trusted advisor. But something within him, perhaps the same shift that had begun the night Elena first kissed the worst of his scars, pushed him toward honesty instead. He admitted, quietly, that Elena's presence had begun to affect him in ways he had not anticipated when he first summoned her from the dungeons weeks earlier. Nathaniel listened without judgment, his expression thoughtful as Ragnar explained the strange improvement in his wound, the moments of genuine connection that had grown between them, and his own uncertainty regarding what this all meant for a king who had sworn off vulnerability since the betrayal that first created his suffering. Nathaniel considered his king's words carefully before responding. He reminded Ragnar gently that not every connection led inevitably toward betrayal, that Vivian's actions, however devastating, did not represent the totality of what trust and affection could offer. He suggested, carefully, that perhaps this unexpected healing represented an opportunity rather than a danger, though he also warned that certain members of the council, Duke Aldrich chief among them, would likely view any growing attachment to a captive as a significant threat to the stability they valued so highly. Ragnar absorbed this warning seriously, understanding the political reality Nathaniel described. He had built his reign on careful control and calculated decisions, and any perception of weakness, particularly regarding a captive of uncertain loyalty, could indeed provide ammunition for those seeking to challenge his authority. Still, as he considered the warmth that had settled within him since Elena's gesture the previous night, he found himself increasingly unwilling to simply abandon whatever was growing between them, out of fear for how others might perceive it. That evening, Elena arrived for her usual visit, though the atmosphere between them had shifted noticeably since the previous night. Ragnar greeted her with a warmth that surprised even his own guards stationed outside the chamber, dismissing them earlier than usual to ensure privacy for their conversation. Elena noticed the change immediately, her heart lifting at the genuine openness reflected in his expression, so different from the guarded distance that had marked their earliest encounters weeks before. They spoke for a long while that evening, the conversation flowing easily between them, in a way that felt entirely natural, despite everything that separated them in terms of status and circumstance. Ragnar told her more about his childhood, about the brother he had lost during the war that claimed so many lives within his kingdom, about the crushing expectations that had settled upon him the moment he became heir to a throne he had never wanted or expected to inherit. Elena listened with genuine compassion, understanding more deeply with each shared memory the weight Ragnar had carried alone for so many years. She shared her own grief in turn, speaking more openly than she had before about the loss of her parents and the quiet loneliness that had followed, tempered only by her aunt's steady guidance and the purpose she had found in dedicating herself to healing others. As their conversation deepened, Ragnar reached for her hand, holding it gently, as he admitted something he had not planned to share so openly. He told her that despite everything within him urging caution, despite years of careful control built specifically to avoid ever feeling this vulnerable again, he found himself genuinely caring for her in a way he had not experienced since long before Vivian's betrayal had taught him to distrust his own heart. Elena's breath caught at his admission, her own feelings mirroring his words closely enough that she found herself unable to hide the emotion rising within her. She admitted, quietly, that her feelings toward him had shifted dramatically since her arrival, that the fear she once carried had transformed into something far more complicated, something that felt dangerously close to genuine affection, despite every reason circumstance provided for maintaining distance instead. Their conversation was interrupted once again, this time by a soft but urgent knock at the chamber door. Edmund entered, his expression tense as he informed Ragnar that Duke Aldrich had requested an immediate audience regarding what he described only as a matter of significant concern to the kingdom's stability. Ragnar's expression tightened at the interruption, though he rose immediately, understanding that ignoring such a request from a senior council member could raise unwanted suspicion at a time when discretion mattered more than ever. Before leaving, he turned back to Elena, his expression carrying a warning she understood immediately. He told her quietly to remain cautious moving forward, explaining that Aldrich had long harbored ambitions of his own regarding influence within the fortress, and that any perceived weakness on Ragnar's part could provide exactly the opening the ambitious Duke had been waiting for. Elena nodded, understanding the gravity of his warning, though she also felt a fresh wave of unease settle over her regarding what might await both of them should their growing connection become known more widely. As Ragnar made his way toward the council chamber where Aldrich waited, his mind raced through possible reasons for such an urgent summons. He suspected, with growing certainty, that this meeting would somehow relate to Elena, whether through direct accusation or more subtle political maneuvering designed to weaken his position regarding her continued presence within the fortress. He entered the chamber to find Aldrich waiting alongside two other senior council members, their expressions carefully neutral, though clearly rehearsed. Aldrich wasted no time addressing the matter directly, expressing concern regarding the captive healer's continued presence within the fortress, and questioning whether her influence over the king had begun to compromise decisions that should remain focused solely on the kingdom's stability and security. Ragnar listened with carefully controlled composure, understanding that any visible reaction, whether anger or defensiveness, would only confirm Aldrich's suspicions regarding his growing attachment. He responded coolly, reminding the council that Elena's healing skills had proven valuable regarding a persistent ailment that had troubled him for nearly a year, and that her continued presence served a practical purpose rather than any personal indulgence unbecoming of his position. Aldrich pressed further, however, suggesting that rumors had begun circulating among the fortress staff regarding the unusual frequency and duration of the healer's visits, rumors that painted a picture far more personal than simple medical necessity. Ragnar felt his composure straining under the weight of Aldrich's carefully chosen words, understanding that the Duke had gathered enough information to pose a genuine threat should he choose to escalate the matter further before the wider council. He responded firmly, reminding Aldrich and the others present that decisions regarding his personal chamber and his choice of physicians remained entirely within his own authority as king, regardless of any rumors circulating among fortress staff. His tone left little room for further argument, though he understood, as he left the chamber moments later, that this confrontation represented only the opening move in what would likely become a far more significant struggle regarding Elena's place within his life and his kingdom. That night, unable to shake the unease Aldrich's confrontation had stirred within him, Ragnar found himself standing outside Elena's quarters, long after the fortress had fallen quiet. He knocked softly, uncertain whether he should have come at all given the growing danger surrounding their connection, though his need to see her outweighed whatever caution remained within him. When she opened the door and saw the troubled expression on his face, she stepped aside immediately, allowing him entry without hesitation, understanding instinctively that something significant had occurred that evening. He told her everything, sparing no detail of Aldrich's confrontation and the clear threat it represented to both of them, should their growing connection become public knowledge, before he had time to properly secure her safety and standing within the kingdom. Elena listened with growing concern, though she reached for his hand regardless, offering what comfort she could, despite the danger clearly closing in around them both. They remained together for a long while that night, speaking quietly of the uncertain path ahead, both understanding that whatever had grown between them over these past weeks now faced its first true test against the political forces determined to see it destroyed before it had any chance to fully bloom. Word of the confrontation between Ragnar and Duke Aldrich spread quickly through the fortress, despite efforts to keep the matter contained within the council chamber. Servants whispered among themselves, and soon enough, the rumors reached ears far beyond the fortress walls, carried by traders and travelers who passed through the surrounding territories. Elena remained largely unaware of how far the whispers had traveled, focused instead on the growing tension that had settled over her daily routine since Aldrich's challenge to the king's judgment. Duke Aldrich, meanwhile, continued gathering support among council members who shared his concerns regarding the healer's influence over their king. He approached each conversation carefully, framing his worries not as personal ambition, but as genuine concern for the kingdom's stability, a narrative that proved surprisingly effective among those already inclined toward caution regarding any perceived weakness in their ruler. Within days, a faction had formed quietly within the council, united by shared unease regarding Ragnar's apparent attachment to a captive of unknown loyalty and uncertain origin. Elena continued her nightly visits to Ragnar's chamber, though both of them remained aware of the growing danger surrounding their connection. The wound along his ribs had continued improving steadily since the night of the storm, the strange markings beneath the surface fading gradually alongside the physical scarring, though Elena suspected the true healing extended far beyond what any physical examination could measure. One evening, as she treated his wound, Ragnar informed her of a decision he had been considering carefully over the past several days. He told her that he intended to address the growing rumors directly, calling a formal gathering of his full council to discuss her status within the fortress openly, rather than allowing whispers and suspicion to continue undermining both his authority and her safety. Elena felt a flutter of fear at his words, uncertain what such a public discussion might mean for either of them, though she trusted his judgment regarding how best to navigate the political complexities surrounding their situation. Before the gathering could take place, however, an unexpected development complicated matters further. A servant, loyal to Aldrich, approached Elena directly one afternoon, claiming to carry a message regarding an urgent matter involving her family back in the border village. Elena felt her chest tighten with immediate concern, following the servant to a quiet corridor, where she was told that her aunt had fallen seriously ill and required assistance that only Elena's specific knowledge of certain rare remedies could provide. Elena's instincts warned her that something felt wrong about the situation, though her genuine concern for her aunt's well-being made it difficult to dismiss the message entirely. She sought out Edmund immediately, explaining what she had been told and asking whether he knew anything regarding conditions within her home village. Edmund's expression grew troubled as he listened, admitting that he had heard nothing regarding any illness affecting her village, and suggesting strongly that the message might represent an attempt to lure her away from the fortress under false pretenses. Elena's fear deepened at his words, understanding immediately the danger such a scheme could represent. If she left the fortress based on false information, she would likely find herself vulnerable to capture, or worse, by those seeking to eliminate her influence over the king entirely. She thanked Edmund for his honesty and made her way immediately toward Ragnar's chamber, understanding that this matter required his attention without delay. Ragnar listened with growing anger as she explained the situation, his expression darkening considerably as he processed the clear attempt to manipulate her away from the safety of the fortress. He assured her immediately that he would investigate the matter thoroughly, promising that whoever had orchestrated this deception would face serious consequences for endangering someone under his direct protection. Elena felt a measure of relief at his firm response, though the incident left her shaken, a stark reminder of exactly how far certain members of the council seemed willing to go in their efforts to remove her from Ragnar's life entirely. The investigation that followed revealed exactly what Elena had feared. The servant who delivered the false message had indeed acted under instructions from someone within Aldrich's growing faction, though the trail of evidence stopped short of directly implicating the Duke himself. Careful planning that suggested experienced political maneuvering, rather than simple opportunism. Ragnar confronted Aldrich privately regarding the incident, though the Duke maintained complete innocence, suggesting instead that perhaps rogue elements sympathetic to his general concerns had acted without his direct knowledge or approval. Ragnar remained unconvinced by this explanation, though he lacked sufficient proof to take direct action against a council member of Aldrich's standing without risking further destabilization within his court. He informed Elena of the outcome, both of them understanding that this incident represented merely the opening move in what would likely become an increasingly dangerous campaign against her continued presence within the fortress. Despite the growing danger, Elena found herself unwilling to retreat from the connection she had built with Ragnar over these past weeks. She told him firmly, during one of their evening conversations, that she refused to allow fear of political consequences to diminish whatever genuine feeling had grown between them. Ragnar's expression softened at her words, though concern remained evident beneath his obvious appreciation for her courage in the face of mounting danger. He proposed, carefully, a plan to address the situation more directly than he had originally intended. Rather than waiting for the formal council gathering he had previously planned, he would instead move immediately to publicly declare Elena under his direct protection, removing any ambiguity regarding her status, and making clear to Aldrich and his faction that further attempts to endanger her would be treated as direct challenges to his authority as king. Elena appreciated the strength of his resolve, though she also worried about the political cost such a declaration might carry for Ragnar personally. She reminded him gently that his position as king depended significantly on maintaining the support and confidence of his council, and that publicly prioritizing her protection over their concerns could weaken that support at a time when unity mattered more than ever, given the ongoing tensions with neighboring territories. Ragnar considered her concerns seriously, though he ultimately remained firm in his decision. He told her that a king who allowed fear of political consequence to dictate every decision was no true king at all, merely a puppet controlled by those seeking to manipulate circumstances for their own benefit. He had spent too many years building his authority through strength and decisive action to abandon those principles now, simply because protecting someone he genuinely cared for happened to carry political risk. The following morning, Ragnar called an urgent gathering of his full council, informing them directly that Elena would remain within the fortress under his explicit protection, and that any further attempts to manipulate or endanger her would be treated with the same severity as any direct challenge to his throne. The announcement was met with mixed reactions throughout the chamber, some council members nodding in quiet acceptance while others, Aldrich chief among them, maintained carefully controlled expressions that betrayed little of their true feelings regarding this bold declaration. Elena, informed of the announcement shortly after it concluded, felt a complicated mixture of relief and continued anxiety settle over her. While Ragnar's public commitment provided a measure of security she had not previously possessed, she understood clearly that this declaration would only intensify the resentment building among those who viewed her presence as a threat to be eliminated, rather than a connection to be respected. That evening, as they sat together in his chamber, Ragnar reached for her hand, his expression carrying both determination and genuine tenderness as he spoke of his commitment to ensuring her safety moving forward, regardless of whatever political cost such protection might ultimately require. Elena leaned into him, grateful for his strength even as uncertainty regarding what dangers still lay ahead continued to weigh heavily upon her mind. She understood, as she had understood from the very beginning of this unexpected connection, that whatever future she might build alongside Ragnar would require far more than simple affection to survive the political forces determined to see it destroyed. But as she felt his hand tighten gently around hers, she found herself believing, perhaps for the first time since her capture, that such a future might genuinely be worth fighting for, regardless of the danger that fighting for it clearly demanded. In the days following Ragnar's public declaration, Elena noticed a subtle shift in how the fortress staff treated her. Where suspicion and quiet resentment had once colored many interactions, a cautious respect began emerging instead, servants and guards alike adjusting their behavior to reflect her new status as someone under the king's direct and openly acknowledged protection. Not everyone welcomed the change, however, and Elena remained acutely aware of the watchful eyes that continued tracking her movements throughout the fortress, particularly those loyal to Duke Aldrich's faction. Ragnar, for his part, seemed lighter in the days following his declaration, as though speaking the truth openly before his council had lifted a burden he had carried silently for far too long. His improved wound continued healing steadily, the strange markings beneath the surface fading almost entirely now, leaving only faint scarring that Elena suspected would remain as a permanent reminder of everything he had endured before finding his way toward genuine healing. One evening, as they sat together following her usual examination of the now nearly healed wound, Ragnar broached a subject he had clearly been considering carefully for some time. He asked Elena directly what she hoped for regarding her own future, acknowledging that her current status, while improved significantly from her original captivity, remained undefined in ways that surely weighed upon her despite her outward composure. Elena considered the question thoughtfully, before answering honestly. She admitted that uncertainty regarding her ultimate fate had indeed troubled her since the earliest days of her capture, though the growing connection between herself and Ragnar had complicated matters far beyond simple questions of freedom or continued captivity. She told him that while she valued the safety his protection provided, she also longed for clarity regarding what role, if any, she might genuinely hold within his life moving forward, beyond simply serving as his healer. Ragnar's expression grew serious as he listened, understanding the fairness of her request for honesty regarding intentions he had perhaps avoided fully articulating even to himself. He admitted that his feelings for her had grown far beyond what he had ever expected when he first summoned a captive healer to treat his stubborn wound, feelings that now extended into territory he had believed permanently closed off following Vivian's betrayal so many years earlier. He told her, with a vulnerability that continued to surprise even himself, that he wished to offer her a place within his life that reflected the true depth of what had grown between them, rather than the ambiguous protection he had provided thus far. However, he also acknowledged honestly that certain obstacles remained before he could fulfill such a promise properly, obstacles rooted not only in political resistance from council members like Aldrich, but also in the lingering curse that, while significantly weakened, had not yet been fully broken. Elena appreciated his honesty, understanding the complexity of the situation they both faced. She reminded him gently that true healing, whether of body or spirit, rarely occurred instantly, and that patience remained necessary as they continued working toward resolving both the political tensions surrounding their connection and the magical remnants still lingering from his past betrayal. Their conversation was interrupted that evening by an urgent summons from Nathaniel, who arrived with troubling news regarding activity along the fortress's eastern border. Scouts had reported unusual movement among forces loyal to a neighboring territory, movement that suggested possible hostile intentions rather than routine patrol activity. Ragnar's expression shifted immediately into the focused determination Elena had witnessed during their earliest encounters, the weight of his responsibilities as king reasserting itself, despite the personal matters they had just been discussing. He excused himself quickly, promising Elena they would continue their conversation once this potential threat had been properly addressed. Elena watched him go with a mixture of pride and concern, understanding that whatever future they might build together would always exist alongside the significant responsibilities his position demanded, responsibilities that could pull him away at any moment, regardless of personal matters requiring his attention. Over the following days, Ragnar remained occupied with preparations addressing the potential threat along the eastern border, meeting frequently with military advisors and dispatching additional scouts to gather clearer information regarding the neighboring territory's true intentions. Elena continued her work within the fortress's healing quarters during this period, using the texts she had acquired to expand her knowledge further, while also tending to injuries and illnesses among the fortress staff and soldiers alike. During this time, she found herself building tentative friendships among some of the fortress residents, particularly a kind healer named Grace, who had served the fortress for many years and possessed extensive knowledge regarding local remedies that complemented Elena's own training beautifully. Grace proved a valuable ally during this uncertain period, offering both practical healing knowledge and quiet reassurance regarding the political tensions Elena continued navigating carefully. One afternoon, while working alongside Grace in the healing quarters, Elena noticed a stranger lingering near the entrance, someone she did not recognize among the usual fortress staff. When she approached to ask if he required assistance, the stranger claimed to be a traveling merchant seeking medical attention for a minor injury, though something about his demeanor struck Elena as carefully rehearsed rather than genuine. She treated his supposed injury cautiously, noting details about his appearance and manner that seemed inconsistent with his claimed profession. After he departed, she mentioned her concerns to Grace, who admitted she too had noticed something unusual about the visitor. Together they reported the encounter to Edmund, who promised to investigate further, understanding the potential significance given the ongoing political tensions surrounding Elena's status within the fortress. The investigation revealed troubling information. The supposed merchant had indeed been an agent working on behalf of Duke Aldrich, sent specifically to gather information regarding Elena's daily routine and vulnerabilities that might be exploited in future schemes against her safety. This discovery confirmed what Elena and Ragnar had both suspected, that Aldrich remained determined to undermine their connection, despite the king's public declaration of protection. When Ragnar learned of this latest development upon returning from his border security preparations, his anger was evident, though he remained careful regarding how directly he could confront Aldrich without sufficient proof to justify more severe consequences. He assured Elena that additional security measures would be implemented immediately to protect her from further schemes, though both of them understood that Aldrich's persistence suggested this conflict would not resolve easily or quickly. That evening, as Ragnar sat with Elena discussing the security concerns and the continued threat from Aldrich's faction, he made a decision that surprised even himself given his usual careful approach to political matters. He told her that he intended to investigate more directly the full extent of Vivienne's original betrayal and the curse she had placed upon him, believing that fully understanding and breaking this curse might not only restore his complete strength, but also demonstrate clearly to his council that he remained fully capable of ruling with the same authority and decisiveness that had always defined his reign. Elena agreed that addressing the curse directly represented an important step forward, both for Ragnar's personal healing and for the broader political situation they continued navigating. She promised to use her own knowledge and skills to assist however possible in this endeavor, understanding that breaking the curse completely might require methods beyond conventional healing that she had not yet fully explored. As they made plans for how to proceed with this new goal, neither of them fully anticipated how dangerous the path toward breaking Vivian's curse would ultimately prove to be, or how close they would come to losing everything they had worked so carefully to build together, in the process of finally confronting the darkness that had haunted Ragnar for so many years. Elena spent the following days researching everything she could find within the fortress library regarding old curses and the methods traditionally used to break them. Grace proved invaluable during this search, sharing knowledge passed down through generations of healers who had served the fortress long before Elena's arrival, including references to ancient rituals capable of severing magical bonds created through betrayal and broken trust. The text suggested that curses of this nature, woven from genuine intention rather than simple spellcraft, could only be fully broken through an equally genuine act of opposing intention, one rooted in authentic care rather than mere ceremony. Elena understood immediately that this explained why her earlier gesture of comfort had weakened the curse significantly without breaking it entirely. A single moment of tenderness, however genuine, likely required reinforcement through a more deliberate and complete ritual to sever the magical bond permanently. She brought her findings to Ragnar, explaining what the old texts suggested regarding the nature of curses born from betrayal. He listened carefully, understanding the implications of what she described, though he expressed concern regarding the potential danger such a ritual might carry, given the powerful and clearly malicious intention Vivian had woven into her original curse. Elena acknowledged the risk honestly, admitting that performing such a ritual without complete certainty regarding its safety carried genuine danger for both herself and Ragnar. However, she also expressed her belief that the curse's continued presence, even weakened as it currently was, represented an ongoing threat to Ragnar's full strength and well-being, one that could resurface with renewed intensity, given sufficient provocation or magical interference from those who might seek to exploit it against him. Ragnar considered her words carefully before responding. He told her that he trusted her judgment completely, understanding better than anyone the depth of care and genuine skill she had demonstrated since her arrival. If she believed this ritual represented the best path toward finally freeing him from Vivian's lingering influence, he would support the effort fully, regardless of whatever danger it might entail for himself personally. They began preparing carefully for the ritual over the following days, Elena gathering specific herbs and materials the ancient texts described as necessary for properly channeling the intention required to break such a powerful curse. Grace assisted throughout this preparation, offering guidance regarding proper timing and technique, while also helping maintain secrecy regarding their plans, understanding the danger that would arise should Aldrich or his faction learn of their intentions before the ritual could be completed. As preparations neared completion, however, an unexpected complication arose. Nathaniel arrived one evening with urgent news that Aldrich had somehow learned of their plans, likely through a spy planted among the fortress staff, who had noticed the unusual gathering of specific herbs and materials associated with old magical rituals. Aldrich, according to Nathaniel's information, intended to use this knowledge to accuse Ragnar of engaging in dangerous and potentially forbidden magical practices, framing the entire situation as evidence that Elena's influence had led their king toward reckless and irresponsible behavior, unbecoming of proper rule. Ragnar's expression darkened considerably upon hearing this news, understanding the serious political danger such an accusation could represent, particularly given the sensitive nature of magical practices within their kingdom's traditions. Elena felt a fresh wave of anxiety settle over her, worried that their efforts to help Ragnar might instead provide Aldrich with exactly the ammunition he needed to finally succeed in his campaign against her continued presence within the fortress. Despite this complication, both Ragnar and Elena agreed that abandoning their plans now would leave the curse's influence unresolved, potentially creating even greater vulnerability moving forward. They decided instead to proceed with the ritual immediately, understanding that completing it successfully and demonstrating its beneficial effects might ultimately undermine whatever accusations Aldrich intended to bring before the council. The ritual itself required a private chamber deep within the fortress, one Grace assured them had been used for similar purposes in generations past, and retained enough residual protective enchantment to help contain whatever magical energy the ritual might release. Elena prepared the space carefully, according to the ancient instructions, arranging specific herbs in a pattern meant to create a protective circle, while Ragnar waited nearby, his expression a mixture of determination and understandable apprehension regarding what they were about to attempt. As the ritual began, Elena guided Ragnar to sit within the prepared circle, instructing him to focus his thoughts on genuine memories of care and connection, rather than allowing old pain and betrayal to dominate his mind. She began speaking the words the ancient texts had provided, her voice steady despite her own nervousness regarding whether this untested ritual would truly succeed in breaking such a powerful and deeply rooted curse. The chamber grew unexpectedly cold as she spoke, the herbs arranged around them beginning to glow faintly with an eerie light that suggested the ritual was indeed engaging with genuine magical forces rather than simple ceremony. Ragnar's breathing grew labored, his expression tightening with visible pain, as the curse within him seemed to resist the ritual's efforts, fighting against the disruption to whatever dark magic had bound it so tightly to his very being for so many years. Elena continued speaking the ritual words despite her growing alarm at Ragnar's obvious suffering, understanding that stopping partway through such a delicate process might prove more dangerous than continuing toward completion. She reached out, placing her hand directly against the healed scarring along his ribs, channeling every ounce of genuine care she felt toward him into the contact, hoping desperately that this final act would provide the decisive push needed to finally sever the curse completely. The chamber flared suddenly with intense light, and Ragnar cried out, his body arching as something powerful and dark seemed to tear away from him entirely, dissipating into the air like smoke finally released from long confinement. Elena held her position steadily, despite her own exhaustion from channeling such intense energy, watching anxiously as the light gradually faded and Ragnar slumped forward, breathing heavily, but clearly no longer suffering the same pain that had marked the ritual's climax. Silence settled over the chamber, as they both remained still for several long moments, processing what had just occurred. Elena finally reached out, gently checking Ragnar's wound, finding it fully healed now, the scarring remaining, but the strange markings that had persisted for so long completely gone, replaced by simple, unremarkable skin that bore no trace of whatever dark magic had once lingered there. Ragnar looked up at her slowly, his expression carrying an emotion Elena had never witnessed from him before, something that looked remarkably like genuine peace settling across features that had carried such careful guardedness since their earliest encounters weeks before. He told her, his voice hoarse but steady, that he felt lighter than he had in years, as though a weight he had carried for so long that he had forgotten its true burden had finally been lifted entirely from his shoulders. Elena helped him rise carefully, both of them understanding the significance of what had just been accomplished. The curse that had haunted Ragnar since Vivian's betrayal, the wound that had resisted every conventional treatment for nearly a year, had finally been broken completely through genuine care and determined effort, rather than any simple remedy or ceremony alone. As they made their way carefully back toward Ragnar's chamber, however, they found Duke Aldrich waiting for them in the corridor, flanked by several soldiers loyal to his faction, his expression carrying a triumphant certainty that suggested he believed he now possessed exactly the evidence needed to finally challenge Ragnar's authority and remove Elena permanently from the fortress they had both fought so hard to protect. Duke Aldrich stepped forward with the confidence of a man who believed victory was already secured, his voice carrying clearly through the stone corridor as he addressed Ragnar directly. He announced, before the assembled soldiers and several council members he had gathered as witnesses, that he had gathered clear evidence of the king engaging in dangerous magical practices under the direct influence of a captive of questionable loyalty and unknown intention. He declared that such reckless behavior demonstrated exactly why he had raised concerns regarding Elena's presence from the very beginning, and called for an immediate council session to address what he termed a serious threat to the kingdom's stability and proper governance. Ragnar straightened fully, despite his recent exhaustion from the ritual, his presence commanding the corridor with an authority that seemed, if anything, stronger and more settled than Elena had ever witnessed from him before. He addressed Aldrich calmly, his voice carrying none of the defensive uncertainty the Duke had clearly hoped to provoke. He informed the assembled witnesses that what Aldrich described as reckless magical practice had, in fact, been a carefully considered effort to break a curse placed upon him years earlier through betrayal, a curse that had caused him significant suffering that his own physicians had failed to properly diagnose or treat for nearly a year. He explained, with a clarity and confidence that seemed to surprise even Aldrich, the full history of Vivian's betrayal and the curse she had woven into the wound that had plagued him ever since. He described how Elena's skill and genuine care had not only identified the true nature of his suffering, but had successfully broken the curse entirely, through the ritual Aldrich now sought to characterize as dangerous and irresponsible. He invited any physician present to examine his previously afflicted wound, immediately, confident that the complete healing now visible would speak far more powerfully than any accusation Aldrich might raise. One of the council members present, a healer who had previously attempted and failed to treat Ragnar's wound, stepped forward at the king's invitation, examining the now fully healed scarring with obvious astonishment. He confirmed openly that the wound, which had resisted every remedy he and his colleagues had attempted for nearly a year, now appeared completely healed, with no trace remaining of the strange markings that had previously accompanied it. This confirmation shifted the mood among the assembled witnesses considerably, several council members exchanging glances that suggested growing doubt regarding Aldrich's accusations. Aldrich, sensing his carefully constructed narrative beginning to unravel, attempted to press his case further, suggesting that regardless of the ritual's apparent success, the very act of engaging in such magical practice represented dangerous precedent that could invite scrutiny from neighboring territories wary of unchecked sorcery within their borders. Ragnar countered this argument firmly, reminding everyone present that the ritual had been conducted privately, with full understanding of the risks involved, and had ultimately resulted in restoring his complete strength and capability as king, precisely the opposite outcome Aldrich's accusations suggested. As the confrontation continued, Elena remained quiet beside Ragnar, understanding that this moment required his voice and authority, rather than her own intervention. She watched as the assembled council members' expressions shifted gradually from uncertainty toward growing support for their king, the physical evidence of his healing proving far more persuasive than Aldrich's carefully worded accusations regarding reckless behavior and questionable influence. Finally, one of the senior council members present, a woman named Beatrice who had served the fortress for many years and commanded significant respect among her peers, spoke up directly, addressing Aldrich with pointed skepticism. She questioned openly why the Duke had gone to such lengths to gather evidence against the king's private healing efforts, suggesting that his persistent campaign against Elena's presence within the fortress seemed to extend far beyond genuine concern for the kingdom's stability, and into territory that resembled personal ambition instead. Aldrich's composure faltered slightly under this direct challenge, and Ragnar, sensing the shifting tide of support among those present, pressed his advantage further. He revealed openly the earlier incident involving the false message meant to lure Elena away from the fortress's safety, along with the suspicious stranger who had been discovered gathering information about her daily routine and vulnerabilities. He connected these incidents directly to Aldrich's faction, presenting the pattern of behavior as clear evidence of a deliberate and sustained campaign against someone under his explicit royal protection. The assembled witnesses grew visibly uncomfortable as Ragnar laid out this pattern of evidence, several exchanging uneasy glances that suggested growing recognition of Aldrich's true motivations, extending beyond simple concern for proper governance. Aldrich attempted several more times to redirect the conversation back toward his original accusations regarding magical practice, but the momentum had clearly shifted away from his favor, the assembled council members increasingly viewing his persistent campaign as evidence of personal ambition rather than genuine loyalty to the kingdom's well-being. Ragnar concluded the confrontation with firm finality, declaring before all those present that Elena would remain under his protection permanently, and furthermore, that he intended to formally name her as his chosen mate and future queen, a declaration that clearly stunned everyone gathered in the corridor, including Elena herself, who had not expected such a significant announcement during this tense confrontation. The assembled witnesses reacted with a mixture of surprise and, gradually, growing acceptance, several council members offering quiet acknowledgement of the announcement, despite the unusual circumstances surrounding its delivery. Aldrich, recognizing that his position had become increasingly untenable given the shifting support among his peers, offered a stiff and clearly reluctant acknowledgement of the king's decision, before withdrawing from the corridor, along with his remaining supporters, understanding that continuing his campaign further would only damage his own standing within the council moving forward. Once the corridor had cleared, Ragnar turned to Elena, his expression softening considerably from the commanding authority he had displayed throughout the confrontation. He apologized quietly for the unexpected nature of his announcement, admitting he had not planned to reveal his intentions in such a public and dramatic fashion, though the moment had felt right, given everything that had just transpired between them and the clear need to establish her position beyond any further question or challenge. Elena, still processing the magnitude of what had just occurred, found herself smiling, despite the tension of the preceding confrontation. She told him that while the timing had certainly been unexpected, she felt nothing but genuine joy at his declaration, understanding fully now the depth of commitment he held toward the future they might build together, a future finally free from both the lingering curse that had haunted him for so long and the political uncertainty that had shadowed her own position within the fortress since her arrival. In the weeks that followed, Ragnar's transformation continued becoming increasingly evident to everyone within the kingdom. Where once his reputation had been built entirely on fear and ruthless control, stories began spreading. Instead of a king who ruled with newfound wisdom and genuine compassion, tempered by the strength and authority that had always defined his leadership, but now balanced by an openness to connection and care that had been entirely absent during the years following Vivian's betrayal. Elena settled comfortably into her new role, continuing her healing work throughout the fortress, while also beginning preparations for her upcoming position as queen alongside Ragnar. Grace remained a close friend and ally throughout this transition, while Edmund and Nathaniel both expressed genuine happiness at witnessing their king finally find the peace and connection he had denied himself for so many years. The formal ceremony naming Elena as Ragnar's queen took place beneath clear skies, several months after the confrontation that had finally exposed Aldrich's schemes and confirmed Ragnar's complete healing from the curse that had once threatened to consume him entirely. Standing before the assembled kingdom, Ragnar spoke openly of the transformation Elena had brought into his life, acknowledging before all his subjects that the strength required to heal from deep wounds, whether physical or emotional, often demanded far greater courage than any battle he had ever fought as their ruler. Elena, standing beside him as his acknowledged equal and partner, felt the weight of everything they had overcome together settle into a quiet and profound gratitude. From her earliest days as a frightened captive dragged into an unfamiliar fortress, she had never imagined the journey that awaited her, one that had transformed not only the broken and guarded king she had first encountered, but her own understanding of courage, healing, and the genuine connection that could grow even from the most unlikely and difficult beginnings. As the kingdom celebrated their new queen and witnessed firsthand the remarkable change that had taken hold of their once feared and distant ruler, Ragnar and Elena stood together, hand in hand, ready to build a future defined not by fear or cruelty, but by the genuine strength that came from having faced the deepest wounds of the past, and emerged, together, entirely transformed.